Hello, this is Lucian Miller from Innov8tive Designs, and in this video we're going to talk to you about proper maintenance of your bearings and how to lubricate the bearings in the Scorpion motors. We've got a lot of questions from people about how do I oil them, where do I oil them, when do I oil them, why should I oil them, all kinds of things like that, and we're going to go over all of that in this video today. Before we actually show you how to oil the bearings in the motor, we're going to talk a little bit about the Scorpion Motor Bearing Lubricant Kit. This kit's available on our website at www.innov8tivedesigns.com, and this kit retails for $5.99. It includes a 1-ounce bottle of the oil, 2 needlepoint applicators, and it also comes with a nice instruction sheet that has a couple of photos here that shows you exactly where to oil your motor. If you've got one of our earlier oil kits that doesn't have the new instruction sheet, we're going to make this available as a download on our website, so you can download it and print it out yourself and have the newest, latest version of this instruction sheet available to you. The oil kit comes with a protective cap locked into it that seals the bottle, prevents it from leaking during shipping. You simply unscrew that and set it aside, and then you pick the needle applicator that you want and screw that down onto the bottle until it's tight, and then pull the cap off. And now the oil kit's ready to use. The Scorpion helicopter motors are the ones that are most commonly oiled because they spin so fast. You know, the 22 millimeter motors are spinning at 40 to 50,000 RPM. The 30 millimeter motors are spinning 35 to 40,000 RPM, and at those speeds the bearings spin very quickly, and it's really easy for the oil to get slung out of the bearings over time. And so that's why we recommend that you do lubricate them from time to time. There are 2 bearings in the motor. The first one's pretty obvious. It's right on the outside of the motor, right around the main shaft here. The other one is down inside the motor, down in the stator, and you can access it through the cooling holes. It's a little hard to see, but if you look down through here, right down through this hole, right down in here is where that other bearing is. If you hold this motor at just the right angle, you can actually see the bearing down in there at the base of this little cone-shaped spacer. And what you're going to want to do to oil the bearings is just reach down in there and just squeeze a little drop of oil out. Spin the motor around a few times to distribute that oil. And then on the other end, you're going to want to put the oil right here underneath the C-clip. So we're just going to get a drop of oil right there. Let that, you can see it kind of oozing down in around, and then spin that motor a few times, and that works the oil down into the motor. Now if you have this motor installed in your helicopter, you can still oil it. You just have to reach down here underneath your pinion gear. If you've got a motor mount plate where it's hard to get to, you can simply put a couple of drops of oil right here on the shaft like that, and it will drip down, it will ooze around that washer and get down into the bearing. And same with this end, you can always get to this end of the motor even when it's in the helicopter. Now in the airplane motors, the air holes are shaped a little bit differently. You can see down in through here. Again, you'd want to oil right down in here. Put a drop of oil, and you can spin that motor a few times to distribute the oil down in there. And then also, right underneath the retaining collar, in that crack under the collar, you can put a drop of oil right down under there, and it'll wick itself down into there, and you spin that motor around a few times, and you'll get the oil down into the bearings. Now on the helicopter motors, we recommend that you lube them up every 10 to 12 flights just to make sure that the bearings don't dry out and that you have plenty of lubrication in them, because they are spinning so fast. And also in a helicopter you have a tremendous side load pushing against the shaft because you have the pinion gear pushing against that main gear, and it does create a very strong side force on the shaft. So the bearings in the helicopters undergo a lot more stress and strain than they do in the airplane motors. because of the side loads and because they're spinning 3 to 4 times faster. For the airplane motors, we've had guys only lubricate their bearings once a flight season or once every couple of months and never have any problems with them. Again, because the motors in the airplane spin at a much lower speed and that there's not as much side load on them, the bearings tend to last a lot longer in the airplane motors. So that's pretty much it on how you would go about lubricating the bearings in your motor. We've had a lot of questions, both through phone calls and emails, where people ask, how do I know when my bearings are bad? What do I look for to see when the bearings are starting to go bad? Well, in helicopters, the thing that you want to look for is any side-to-side play in the shaft. When you take your helicopter out to the flying field, at the beginning of each flying session, what you'll want to do is wiggle the main gear back and forth a little bit so that you rotate the shaft on the motor. And you'll want to make sure that that shaft just rotates. You don't want to see any side-to-side movement in that shaft. If you see any side-to-side movement at all in the pinion gear while you're turning the main gear, that's a good indication that your bearings are going bad or already have gone bad and they're about to blow out on you. So if you do see that, do not fly the helicopter. Take it out of service and pull the motor out and make sure that the bearings are fine. Now, in an airplane situation, when you have your prop adapter on the front of the motor, you can grab the tips of the prop blades and rock them back and forth. And it should be nice and solid. If you feel the motor rocking at all when you grab it by the prop tips, then that's a good indication that your bearings have worn out and need replacing. With a properly set up motor, it's okay to have a little bit of play in and out in this direction, you know, if the motor goes in and out this way, because the motors will typically have a few thousandths of an inch of play that way. But you don't want any play side to side or up and down in them, because that would indicate that the bearings are starting to go bad. Another thing that you can do to check to see the health of the bearing, if you're going to be taking the motor apart to work on it, if you take either the retaining collar for an airplane motor or the C-clip on a helicopter motor, if you remove that from the motor, pull that out, and pull the two halves of the motor apart, a really quick way to check the bearing health is to just plug the motor in so the shaft just goes in the end of the motor like that and give the motor a spin. The bearings should feel nice and smooth and with no roughness on them, and you can do that on both ends like this. Slide that in there, give it a spin. If the bearings are going bad, it'll feel real rough and gravelly, almost like the bearings are full of sand. Both of these feel really nice and smooth, so this particular motor is fine. But if you do get a situation where you feel a gravelly feeling, then you know that the bearings are bad. We have a lot of people calling us with issues about the bearings in the helicopter motors, and in 99% of the cases, the bearing problems in helicopters are due to improper installation by the user or improper setup of the gear mesh between the main gear and the pinion gear. The simplest way to make sure that you get this setup is to use a little thin piece of paper. This is just a regular piece of printer paper, and I'm going to cut me out a little feeler gauge out of this paper, just a little under 1/4 inch wide. And what you'll want to do when you set the gear mesh up is you're going to want to run this down in between the pinion and the main gear, wiggle it back and forth a few times, and you can see how easily this one goes in because the mesh is set up properly in this helicopter. But if you set that in there, get it where you want it, and then tighten your screws down on your motor, that's going to leave the proper amount of gap between the main gear and the pinion. Then once you're done, you can run that little piece of paper through there, take it out, and now you've got the perfect amount of play. If you can see how if you grab this main gear, it will wiggle just the tiniest little bit side to side, and that's what you want to feel. You want just a tiny little bit of play in that main gear so that you don't have too much tension between the main gear and the pinion gear, which puts stress and strain on the bearings. There's a few other things that I wanted to talk about in this video concerning bearings in general. a lot of people have mistaken notions about how long bearings should last, or how to care for bearings or other things like that. Bearings do not last forever. They never will, and they never have. And when you have the bearings in the motors, people need to understand that they're operating in a very extreme environment. In a typical helicopter motor, the bearings will spin around 250,000 times per flight. And in some of the larger 700 size helicopters, the amount of side force that's on the shaft is in excess of 200 pounds of side force when you're pulling really high collective maneuvers. So that's a very, very tough environment for the bearings to operate in. And so you want to make sure that they're set up properly in order to make them last as long as they possibly can. When you take care of your bearings properly, you set the gear mesh up properly, you're going to be able to get several hundred flights from a set of bearings. We've had some of our factory pilots get as many as 1,500 flights from a set of bearings with doing no maintenance whatsoever, and that's because they had them set up properly. So anytime that you're having an issue with a bearing going bad, you really need to look at your setup. You've either got your pinion main gear mesh set up too tight, or the motor's crooked with respect to the main gear, or you've got binding somewhere in the system that's putting extra load on the bearings or something like that. But as long as the motors are installed properly and the gear mesh is set up properly, you should be able to get hundreds of flights from a set of bearings before you have any problems with them at all. Well, hopefully now we've cleared up the questions you've had about how to oil the bearings in your Scorpion motors. So be sure to watch our other videos that we also have on how to change shafts and bearings in motors, and also proper soldering techniques and other topics. These are all available on our website at www.innovativedesigns.com. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.